Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Athena Aramful, and I'm a junior at New Explorations into Science, Technology, and Math High School in New York City, otherwise known as NESPLSM. Today is the Genealogy Club's second flagship event, our I.D.E.A, Diversity and Dissent. We have two esteemed speakers, Nick Sheedy and Dr. Tina Lasisi. Nick Sheedy is the lead genealogist at Finding Your Roots, and Dr. Lasisi is a postdoctoral researcher at Penn State University.
So some housekeeping rules before we get started. If you have questions for the speakers, please type them into the chat, and we'll look at your questions in or into the QA. You can type them into the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll be looking for your questions in both places. And at the end of the presentations, there'll be a Q&A at the end of the webinar, so we'll answer all the questions there. We'll also be posting links in the chat, so you can look out for those too.
Alrighty. So once again, just a little introduction of our team. My name is Athena Ramphal, and I'm the founder of Genealogy Club. And here with us today, we have the rest of the Genealogy Club team. Elizabeth couldn't make it today. She's our vice president, so shout out to her. But on to the rest of the team.
I'm Clara Miller, and I'm also a junior at NEST, like Athena and Liz, and I'm the secretary of Genealogy Club.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stephen Koss, and I'm the faculty advisor for our Genealogy Club.
Okay, cool. So now just like a little bit of background on how the Genealogy Club came to life at NEST. So back in 2017, I attended a program called Finding Your Roots to Seedlings. That's also where I met Dr. Lasisi, shout out to her. So it aimed to show how interested kids are in finding ways through genealogy to answer the question, who am I?
And the webisodes were inspired by the popular PBS documentary series called Finding Your Roots with Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr.
So just a quick heartfelt thank you to Professor Gates for building the foundation for the program and for carrying it out with Professor Nina Jablonski, who is actually in our audience today. So hi. And also a special thank you to Dr. Brandon Abunu for being one of the best mentors and making us laugh with every single concept he taught. Clara?
Yeah, we'd also like to thank Christian Berg at the WPSU team for filming and editing the 9 episodes. So make sure to check out the Science U website and stay tuned for the home special that is coming to a channel near you in March. I'm going to put the link in the chat.
The program was phenomenal, and that is exactly what we aim to mimic at our meetings by using their curriculum created by Elizabeth Wright. We did some really fun activities in person, and we have so many virtual fun activities planned because the Finding Your Roots curriculum was actually updated for virtual accommodations. And we actually will be using those activities in our upcoming Seedlings of the Caribbean pilot program, hosting 30 students from Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago, funded by the 2021 Women in Bio Inclusion Grant.
Okay, so our club ethos is I.D.E.A, which is an acronym for Identity, Diversity, Exploration, and All-Inclusive. And the idea, so there's a bit of a timeline. The idea for Genealogy Club was born with Finding Your Roots, the Seedlings, in 2017, and was eventually founded in 2019. We held our first major event in 2020, our first webinar, which can be found on our link tree posted in our Instagram bio. So follow us at Nest M Genealogy Club. And we have many more things coming up for the future, so stay tuned.
So recently so this is just a little bit about our network and how we've expanded throughout the years. We've expanded to the Caribbean and Australia most recently, and we hope to reach many more students across the globe as we go on. So moving on to our presentations. So that was just a quick introduction. So now for the presentations. Our first speaker is Nick Sheedy. He is a professional genealogist and current lead genealogist for the show Finding Your Roots, and has conducted extensive research on the show's diverse guests. His experience includes a wide variety of genealogical projects for the past 25 years. He has conducted research at many places across the United States and Canada. So please give a warm welcome to Nick Sheedy and his presentation, How to Find Your Roots.
Thank you so much, Athena. I really appreciate the introduction there. Can people see me? Is that, I don't know if people can see me. I'm not clean shaven as I was in my little headshot there, but it's cold in Montana, so I put on my beard. And we try to stay warm and dry up here. So welcome and thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure. It's a pleasure for me to be able to share some of what I do and a little bit of what I know. Quite often when I give a presentation like this, I'll ask for a show of hands. How many people out there know everything? Raise your hand if you know everything. Nobody raises their hand. I'm not going to raise my hand because nobody knows it all. We can all learn something from each other. And especially in genealogy, genealogy is a really interesting field because there's so much diversity in it, nobody could know it all. Genealogy is the study of family history, how we're related, our ancestry, our descent. And in some ways, it's really unique in that your pedigree, your ancestry is just yours. You have two parents, you have four grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, or yeah, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and that pedigree is unique to you and your full siblings. Nobody else on earth shares that specific pedigree. Now, you share parts of that pedigree with your parents. Half of your pedigree is the exact same as your father's. Half of your pedigree is the exact same as your mother's. And if you go out to aunts and uncles, cousins, segments of your pedigree are shared with all of your relatives. So on the one hand, your pedigree and your genealogy is very unique to you. And on the other extreme, we share this common history with everyone on earth. Because if you go back far enough, we're all related. And that's always been very interesting to me. I've read some statistical analysis that in Europe, for instance, the statistics said around the year 900, everybody who was living in the year 900 in Europe who had children are likely the ancestors of every living person today who has any European ancestry. Now, that's not to say, oh, you're related somehow to some of those people. The point was that every single person who was alive in Europe in the year 1100 or 1100 years ago, in the year 900, is an ancestor of you, if you have any European ancestry. Well, that means that anyone with any European ancestry is going to be a cousin within the last 1100 years, not just somehow, but on every single line. And so the whole European family tree would come back together within the last 1100 years. Now, there could be some outliers with communities that were isolated in some Swiss valley or way up north in Scandinavia or in Iceland or somewhere. Certain communities, the Basque community, the Roma community, the Jewish community who tended to intermarry within their own communities. There could be some outliers there. But that's going to be true, not just in Europe, but in Asia, in Africa, in North America, in South America. At some point within the past few hundred to a few thousand years, we're related. And if you go back tens of thousands of years, everybody's related on every single line. And so sometimes I ask myself, well, why in the world do we even care about genealogy? If everybody's so closely related, why don't we just, everybody's my cousin, and it's true. And the answer to that, of course, is we love the stories, we love the connections, and by researching our family trees, learning that we have a personal connection to these people that lived in historic times, that gives us a personal connection to that history. And so genealogy research is really cool because it connects us to the past in a very personal way. And part of the theme of this presentation is diversity. Well, genealogy is an extremely diverse field because families are diverse, people who came from different places that are diverse. But if you get right down to an individual level, every person on earth is unique. We each have unique DNA. that was inherited from two parents. And like I said, everybody's pedigree is unique. If you map out your family tree, you share that family tree with full siblings. Your pedigree is the same as full siblings. But even on a DNA level, you only share about half of your DNA with full siblings. So if you get down to the individual level, we are very diverse at a very personal level. Every person on earth is a unique individual. And so in genealogy research as a field, we have this great diversity. And if you want to research your family tree, your own family tree, you know, your family may not be as diverse as, you know, all humanity. And so most people start out researching their own family. And so you have two types of experience that you get from genealogy as you move along. I've been doing my own family tree for, gosh, almost 30 years, probably, since I was in high school. And I've been pretty serious about it for the last 20, 25 years. But I didn't get the level of experience that I have until I decided I might try to become a professional genealogist. I had a lot of skills, and I visited a lot of archives and courthouses, and I knew how to go about it. But I had only researched my own family tree and done a little work for a few other people to help them. And so in genealogy research, you have two types of experience. You have depth of experience and you have breadth of experience. So depth of experience is where you get really good. You become an expert in a particular area. Maybe not an expert, but you really focus your research in a particular area and you do a deep dives. And so in my own family tree, I had a lot of Quaker ancestors on my father's side of the family. And I really dug deep into the Quaker records and I really got a lot of experience there. I have depth of experience in that area. But then at breadth of experience, you know, in my own family tree, I have people from all over the United States, but most of them trace back, almost all of them trace back to Europe. And some were more recent immigrants, some were very early immigrants in colonial times. But I felt like I had a pretty broad foundation for this sort of research. And then I met my dear friend and mentor, the late Johnny Cerny, and she said, well, buckle up, you know, I'll take you on a wild ride. And doing work professionally, and especially for finding roots, I rapidly had to gain a breadth of experience because I'd never researched someone whose family came from Korea or the Middle East, Lebanon, South America, India. These are places that I had never even started to do any research there. And then with African American research, it's you know, a very unique field because we have this very peculiar institution that used to be legal in the United States, and that's slavery. And when you get into slave research, there's very particular records and very particular ways you have to go about it. And so to gain experience in genealogy, again, breadth of experience and depth of experience. And it all comes down to the diversity of the sort of research that you're asked to do. If you're doing your own family tree, it's not going to be anywhere near as diverse in breadth as if you're a professional genealogist and you have clients coming to you. You just have to take what's handed to you. For our guests on Finding the Roots, we never know where the research is going to lead. Oftentimes, we don't know even exactly where our guests' ancestors may have come from. You know, we think that somebody would be a fantastic guest, and we find out that you know, they had roots in Armenia or Lebanon or places that are very difficult to research. And so, oftentimes, we're handed a family tree that we have to work with, and we have to do our best to make a diligent effort to identify as many ancestors as we can and reach out to relatives sometimes to get family pictures, stories, and to further the research, and then try to find records and documents that help us tell stories for the show. But when it comes back to diversity in your own family or diversity in any family that you might research, there's lots of different types of diversity. Of course, we can think of ethnic diversity and racial diversity, but you have diversity of language. In genealogy, that's a big one because the records might be in different languages. If you go to do Jewish research, you need to probably have some foundation in Hebrew because Jewish gravestones are very important. Jewish gravestones will often, almost always, give a person's name in Hebrew and name their father. And so doing Jewish research, when we try to take ancestors back to the boat and profile that immigrant generation family, one record or one thing that we go after are gravestones, because gravestones will tell us a father's name. You might not get any other record in the United States that tells us the name of the father of someone in that immigrant generation. Now, if they came over and they got married here, great. Maybe you might get parents' names on a marriage record. And they died here, great. You might get parents' names off of a death certificate, but those may be Americanized versions of the name. If you look at a Jewish gravestone, that Hebrew is going to give you the Hebrew name of the person and the father. And so then you hope you find another record somewhere in that immigrant generation that tells you where they came from, but now you have names where you can focus wherever they came from. And although we got this name through a Hebrew inscription on a gravestone, now we're going to Poland or Belarus or Ukraine or Latvia, wherever they came from, and we're going to be reading Polish, or we're going to be reading Russian in Cyrillic. And I don't read Russian in Cyrillic. And so that sort of research we pass off to an expert. And so while I have, some breadth of experience here, I don't have the depth of experience, and I don't have the language skills to jump over the pond and go to an archive in Belarus. And so we have a go-to guy in Belarus. We have go-to people in Poland or Ukraine. And Ukrainian research is really interesting because it seemed like no matter who we contacted in Ukraine, they all seem to know each other. It's almost like a genealogy cartel. And so, but they have depth of experience in their field. They are very specialized. And so, if any of you are thinking about becoming professional genealogists at some point, the question is, well, what kind of a genealogist do you want to be? If you've researched your own family and you've become very familiar with a certain type of research, whether it's African-American research or Jewish research or colonial American research, is that where you really want to focus? Or you become a professional genealogist and you find out some of your clients are asking you to do certain things. A lot of people who called me as a professional genealogist had a family story. My great-great-grandma was full-blooded Cherokee, and how can I get on those rolls? And so, that's handed to me. And I'm like, well, I didn't realize I'd be doing so much Native American research. And I'd say 90% of the time, I'd say, take a DNA test, see if the DNA tells you you have any Native American ancestry. And most of the time it came back, no, they did not. And so I'm like, it's not worth even looking. And so I learned that very quickly. But if you want to be a professional genealogist, if you want to try to make a career of this, how do you go about doing that? And most people specialize in a very specific field. I have a good friend named Gordon Remington, who is one of the leading experts in New York genealogy. He's from upstate New York or Western New York. I guess in New York, that's kind of a hotly debated topic. Where does upstate and Western New York start? So I won't get into that with Gordon, but he's an expert in New York genealogy. I have other friends, genealogists, who are experts in German genealogy. They're experts in West Prussian genealogy. All of the time on Finding Your Roots, we reach out to our go-to people in Mexico or Ireland or Italy. And these are people that really specialize in a specific field. And we rely on them to access records that we don't have access to. And also to focus their research because they know where to look. They may have access to or knowledge of record groups that we're not familiar with, or we don't even know exist. And so we did some recent research for a guest I can't name yet because it's not public, but he had German roots. and we wanted to get some German military records from World War I and World War II. Well, I have no idea where those are kept. So we contacted a German specialist, and they had a few ideas, put us in touch with someone in Germany. And of course, with COVID, a lot of archives and repositories are still closed, or they're only open on a very limited basis. But we talked to somebody who knew exactly where to look. They went in and they either got what we needed, or they said they couldn't find it. Or in one case, I think that the record group was so huge and it wasn't well indexed, or not indexed at all. You just have to thumb through thousands of pages to try to find what we might have been looking for, not even knowing whether or not it's there. And so, yeah, in family groups, I mentioned you have ethnic diversity, you have racial diversity, you have this diversity of language. You also have geographic diversity. People come from, different parts of the United States, Southern United States versus Western United States, Midwestern, Mid-Atlantic, New England. In the United States, we have a sort of diversity. There's some cultural diversity there, a little bit of language. You have, folks in Maine have a different accent than folks in Alabama. I grew up out west in the Pacific Northwest. I don't think I have an accent. I'm sure other people might think I do. But growing up in Oregon and Idaho and Montana, I didn't think I had an accent, but my cousins from Boston would come out and visit, and I always loved the Boston accent. But then you have diversity of religion, diversity of politics, and my favorite is you have diversity of interest. And this goes down to a really individual level, and I think it covers all bases. But diversity of interest is you're just interested in different things. If we were all interested in the same thing and nobody, there was no diversity of interest, we wouldn't break into new fields. There would be no innovation. We wouldn't make new discoveries. And so, but also without diversity of interest, you can't have division of labor, because we have a very diverse economy. We have all sorts of different jobs that need to be done, and different people with different interests go out and find their calling and do different types of work. And I don't know, how to rebuild my car engine, so I rely on somebody else who has specific knowledge of rebuilding a car engine if they want to do that. Now, if they want their family tree done, they might not have any idea how to go about that. Well, I'm happy to take a look. And so when you're researching your family tree, how does this diversity play into it? Well, your family tree is probably not as diverse as everything we're talking about. Most people, their parents, I shouldn't say that. A lot of people, parents or grandparents eventually came from a community, and especially the further you go back, you'll get less diversity within a family group. People tended not to move as much. And so as you move forward in time, especially the last 500 years, 100 years, the last 50 to 70 years, people have become so much more mobile that you have families from very different backgrounds, different places, different religions, different ethnicities, finding themselves in different places, intermarrying. And we have become, as Americans especially, but really across the globe, we've become far more diverse than at any point in history. And I find that very interesting from a number of perspectives, but also just because of DNA, the DNA that we carry is a lot more diverse than our ancestors, say 100 to 200 to 500 years ago. The reason that we're able to take a cheek swab or take a spit in a tube and send it off to Ancestry or 23andMe, and you get that pie chart back and it says, oh, what percentage of your DNA came from what part of the world? Well, it's because there's certain profiles of people who have lived in a specific place for a long time, whether it's Native Americans or people in Ireland or Scotland or Germanic people, wherever they came from there. Then in Africa, you have specific historical regions where specific historical nations and tribes would have occupied. And these companies have gone out and taken reference samples from people that they hope represent a population that has been in a specific place for a long time. And so you send your DNA sample off and it comes back and you get this pie chart that says, oh, you are 3% from Benin in Africa and 8% North African and so much different parts of Europe or Asia. If you have any Native American, that'll show up. And the only reason we're able to do that is because people 500 years ago had far less genetic diversity than we do today. And so 500 years from now, I don't know if they'll be able to do what they do today, because the genome, the human genome across the board, is becoming far more fluid. And that's happened over the centuries and millennia with the last great ice age and with migrations out of Africa. And it's one reason why we're able to use DNA with haplogroups to plot where specific populations branched off with others and how long ago, on direct male lines, direct maternal lines, because there's always been points at which bottlenecks happened and specific groups broke off from another and went in a totally different direction. But with that, I think I should mention in Europe, it would have been the last great ice age when you ended up having a bottleneck and people moved down into the southern part of Europe, some of the Mediterranean region, into the Middle East. In Africa, it's a little different. I think Africa used to be far more hospitable to hunter-gatherers. It was far less dry, and people didn't have to move great distances to find sustenance. You might have migrations, seasonal migrations, but I think the same probably in North America, pre-European expansion into North America. You have certain regions where certain Native American tribes ended up settling, and they stayed there for a long time. They may have moved around just a little bit, but they settled in a place and they ended up staying there for hundreds of years. In Africa, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. And so we're able to, in Africa, say, oh, you have these percentages of DNA from these specific ethnic groups. In North America, because all of Native Americans are so closely related, that's more difficult to do. At this point, we can differentiate between South American and North American. Sometimes they can get regional, say Mexican or Central American. But within the United States, at this point, I'm not aware of any DNA tests where they can take a DNA swab and say you're connected to a particular tribe. They might be able to get to a region, but not necessarily a particular tribe. And so with that, you research your family tree, you know a little bit about them. And what do you do with this information? Well, and why? Why are you interested in your family tree? Most of us are interested in the stories. We want to know where we came from. We want to know how we got here. We're curious. To be a good genealogist, you really have to have a natural curiosity. And so you do your family history research, you learn some things about your family, and what do you do with that? Well, hopefully you internalize that a little bit. You have a better understanding how your family, got to where they are, from where they came from to where they are now, because we all came from someplace else at some point. And then take that knowledge and it gives you a better understanding of where we are today. How did we get here? And there's an old saying that, people that don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. Well, if you do know your family history, and you also, that gives you a context of your family within broader history, like general history. If you have an understanding of that, it gives you a much better foundation to understand how we got to where we are today, whether it's politics, religion, race relations, anything, our climate. How did we get to the situation where we are? And that better informs us to make decisions to move forward. Because I don't think anybody's going to say, oh, I don't want to make the world a better place. But we all want the world to be a better place. And how to go about doing that? Well, you need to be informed. And doing family history research, I think, is very valuable because you learn where your family came from. If you research other people's family trees or you swap stories with your friends, you learn about where their families came from and why. And then you use that knowledge, internalize it to have a little more grace with other people. If you have an understanding of your own family, that's great. If you have an understanding of someone else's family, maybe somebody whose family's background is entirely different than yours, that can help you understand where they are today and how they got there. And so you can be empathetic then to someone else's situation. And I think that's very valuable. And I think on finding your roots, a lot of viewers end up kind of trying to put themselves in that position. You learn about somebody whose family tree is entirely different than your own, maybe, and you can really empathize with the guest who's learning about the Armenian genocide or the Holocaust or the wars, World War I and World War II were terrible in Korea. We just had a guest whose ancestors migrated to the United States during the Mexican Revolution. And we put that in context about how bad it was in Mexico. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed or died. In Europe, Eastern Europe especially, there was pretty serious famine during World War I and World War II both, that would affected civilians, even if they weren't directly involved in the fighting. And so you learn a little bit about the context, that historical context, what motivated people to move, say immigrate to the United States, but also, for people to, take an attitude that we're going to survive. And so hopefully we take this knowledge that we learn from the past, we have established a personal connection to it because we've researched our own family. We kind of have an idea how our family fits into that. And then moving forward, hopefully we use that knowledge. To say something else about that, the past is done. We can't change it. But history is not static. History moves on. Today will be tomorrow's history. And our ancestors were not just pawns in history. They were players. History didn't just have an influence on people, motivating them to do things. How people acted and what they did influenced history. That's true today. You might go through your life on a day-to-day basis and think, oh, well, this is happening, that's happening, this is how it affects me. It motivates me to do this, it motivates me to do that. Maybe something happens, you get angry about it, you decide to try to make a difference, try to change something. And now you are actually having an influence on the present and future history. And so history is not static. History isn't just something that happened and it's done, it continues. And our family trees continue. That's the other beautiful thing about family history research. A lot of people, and when I started out too, I was interested in all of my ancestors, my parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and on back. And here's an interesting story about an aunt or an uncle. Oh, there's a cousin. Well, now you're second cousins, and you can branch out to third cousins. And that's what I started to talk about to begin with was, we're all connected somehow. But then going forward, what are you going to do with your family history write it down, preserve it, pass it on to the next generation. If you don't have kids, maybe your nieces, your nephews, cousins are going to be interested in that. And so time marches on, families march on, and there's a continuity to it all, to the history, to the human story. And I find it fascinating. I hope you find it fascinating. Of course, you're in genealogy club, so I would imagine you do. I think we're coming up on our time here. I don't want to go over too long if we're going to save time for questions and answers at the end. So I'll just wrap it up by saying, lastly, that you research your family history. And, you know, of course, some people are adopted or they don't know a biological parent or a grandparent, and there's a branch of that biological family tree missing. In some ways, and I've even talked to some adoptees that I've worked for and tried to, you know, identify their biological families. In some ways, they say, well, it's kind of liberating because, you know, I didn't have that baggage. You know, I could choose who I want to be. Other people, you know, latch onto that heritage, that family history, and you know, they want to embrace it and carry it forward. But I've also encountered people doing family research who say, you know, my grandpa was a mean drunk and I don't want that cycle to continue. And they learn more about their family tree and they learn he came from a long line of mean drunks. And so you're not necessarily, you don't have to inherit that. A lot of people decide that the heritage that they've been, that got them to where they are is something they don't want to continue. And so that's part of this diversity, I think, because you have a choice as an individual. You're your own person. Do you want to embrace the heritage that, you know, has come down through the generations and carry it forward, or maybe not? And so hopefully, when you do your family tree, you learn something about where you come from, but I think more importantly, you learn a little bit more about who you are today, who do you want to be tomorrow, and how do we make the world a better place for generations to come. So with that, I'll close, and I look forward to the next speaker.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Sheedy, for that wonderful presentation. So I'll present our second speaker is Tina Lasisi, a postdoctoral researcher at Penn State, and she has spent her time researching the genetic architecture and evolutionary function of human scalp hair morphology. She writes about the effects of scientific racism on our understanding of human phenotypic diversity. Athena?
Thank you for that introduction. Athena, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, really quickly. So right before, I just want to obviously get onto Tina's presentation. I just wanted to say in 2017, she was a guest speaker at Finding Your Roots of Seedlings. And after she gave an amazing presentation on skin color, 2 other seedlings and I were fangirling at the end. So without further ado, here is Tina's presentation, Hair and Skin, the Evolution of Human Diversity.
Thank you for that introduction. It was a wonderful experience for me too. So let me share my screen. Could you enable screen sharing, please?
It should be enabled.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen now. Can I get a thumbs up from you, Athena, if that's the case? Okay, awesome. So yes, I'm going to be talking to you today about hair and skin and the evolution of human diversity. So the reason I focus on these traits is because of their history as so-called racialized traits. And this history makes them great examples of how perception can distort what we study. I think that there are few phrases that confuse people as much as race is a social construct, and yet it's something that is often offered as an explanation. So as a biological anthropologist, I noticed that in my discipline, we often find ourselves involved in conversations about what race is and what it isn't. And depending on who you ask, anthropologists are either partially or entirely responsible for the invention of race. So it's pretty hilarious that anthropologists are some of those who are working hardest to basically make up for what their predecessors did. But the main question that drives my research and that I think of when I want to talk to people about, their ideas of race is, how does human variation actually work? If it's not race, how can we think about it? What are the issues with us thinking about it within racial frameworks, and what's the reality of it? Now, reality is a tough thing to get at, right? Because we really are limited by our perception. So we start from the point of whatever our perception is, and then that will somehow interact with reality. And as scientists, often we have the benefit of having another intermediate, which is measurement. So in a lot of ways, measurement can be what allows us to go beyond our perception and understand reality in another way. But unfortunately, measurement is not always objective, and it's not always a simple question of, seeing something and saying, okay, we're going to measure that now. So what I consider to be the main issue in science, and when we talk about human variation, is that we have a phenotyping problem. So a phenotype, or an observable trait that someone has, if you want to measure it and study it, one of the things that you can name that is phenotyping that trait. So phenotyping hair, phenotyping skin pigmentation, those are things that we do. But one of the big questions that we have to ask ourselves as scientists is, what exactly are we actually phenotyping? Is this really a phenotype, or is this something that is just a subjective description of something that I'm perceiving? And this will make a lot more sense when I give you the specific examples of skin and hair. But there's two ways that really shapes the way that we talk about human variation. And the first is that having this biased phenotyping distorts variation. So it makes certain types of variation seem more extensive or more important than others. It can make, certain things be homogenized. And then the second way this distorts human variation is by the creation of so-called composite traits. So there's a lot to think about when you are trying to measure a trait. And one of the most important things you need to think about is the biology of that trait and whether that is a single trait. So for example, you can think about hair color, for example. You can say, okay, is hair color a separate trait, or do we talk about pigmentation in general? Is there such a thing as, simply eye color, or are there multiple components to this? And being able to tease apart these two things is so important when we're talking about human variation, because the way that human biology varies across different populations is something that isn't as simple as saying, okay, we're going to make this type of human and then that type of human. So with that introduction, basically what I'm going to talk about today is skin color. Then I'm going to talk about hair morphology. And in both these cases, I'm really trying to give you examples of how we do phenotyping for these traits. And then I want to give you a little preview into some of the work I've done on hair genetics that can help you understand how the visible parts of human variation interface with genetics. And so a lot of the stuff that Nick Sheedy talked about in terms of descent and DNA. And then at the end, I'm going to give you a few of my thoughts on, how we should move forward based off of what we know so far. So starting with skin color. Skin color is a fantastic trait to look at if you want to understand how much we can gain from improving our approach to measuring traits. So the machine that you see here is a reflectance spectrophotometer, and it's a very cool little machine that is able to give you a measure of skin pigmentation. And the way that it works is that it reflects light and it gets readings on the light that is reflected back. And it takes that information and it says, okay, this is the percentage of light that was reflected back at all of these different wavelengths. And basically we can use all of that information to calculate something called Melanin Index, which is a measure of how much melanin someone has in their skin. And this is the gold standard for objectively measuring skin pigmentation these days. However, this wasn't always how we talked about skin pigmentation. The earliest way of discussing skin pigmentation involved literally assigning colors to races. Now, this is a huge simplification, and there's a lot of issues with this. So one of the main things that you have to think about here is, can you really divide all of humanity into 4 groups? And can you really say that they have 4 different skin colors that are non-overlapping? It's not that simple. I could promise you that much. And these are not accurate representations of the variation within the groups or the variation between the groups. Now, I don't want to imply that you should never compare groups, because you can actually learn a lot from comparing groups. For example, we learned a lot about the genetics of skin pigmentation by comparing West Africans with Northeast Asians and Northern Europeans, and asking the question of, okay, well, what is it genetically that makes East Asians and North Europeans both have lighter skin? And what we learned in this case is, okay, these populations evolved under a similar kind of natural selection pressure, which meant that they had to have lighter skin. And so we learned about convergent evolution and how both of these populations evolved lighter skin, even though it had different genetic bases. And that is something that you can do while comparing groups to each other. But if you just stick to comparing groups, you can miss a lot of variation. For example, if it wasn't for the use of reflectance spectrophotometers and understanding Melanin Index, we wouldn't have been able to pick up on the incredible range of variation that exists within the African continent. So if you think back to those, racial groups that people made thinking about skin color, you cannot talk about variation if you are going to say that everyone in a group has the same phenotype. And that's rarely the case. Now, despite the fact that we have this incredible little machine, reflectance spectrophotometers, that we have M-Index, we still see the persistence of categorical approaches to skin color, like the Fitzpatrick Scale. Now, what is the Fitzpatrick Scale? For those of you who are unfamiliar, the Fitzpatrick Scale is a classification scheme that's used in dermatology. There's a lot that I could say about it, but to keep it brief, it basically says there are different phototypes of skin, and it identifies 6 different types of skin that each correspond with a skin tone, a sensitivity to ultraviolet radiation, and a cancer risk. And what is actually fantastic about the Fitzpatrick Scale is that it is a great thing to use as a bad example. This is what happens when you create categories that don't necessarily reflect reality. And based off of this information itself, people struggle to actually say, okay, this is the skin color that you have, this is where you are on the scale, this is the group that you fit into. And so what I think is really interesting is looking at how people have visualized the Fitzpatrick Scale to help people categorize others, because it shows just how inaccurate and kind of ridiculous the scale is. So this is one of the examples that I found. I would like you to note how Brad Pitt is classed as light brown. So what you're seeing here is that there is a huge range of variation among people who are predominantly of European ancestry. Like there's 4 categories worth of variation there. And people of African ancestry who are African American or Afro-Caribbean, they don't have a lot of variation according to the Fitzpatrick scale. They just can be divided up to 2 different groups. Now we can even go into details about, does it make sense to put this person in the same group as these 2? That kind of lets you think about how people aren't necessarily just looking at the trait that they're describing. But to think about the variation, let's ask the question, is there more variation in skin color if you measure it objectively in Europeans than there is in Africans? Well, there isn't. Here, if you look at M index, so going from 30 to over 100, if you look at the ranges of variation that we find in Europeans that are here in the blue, they're a very small proportion of the range of variations that humans have. When we look across Asian populations and African populations, they span a much larger range of variation. But what happens is that when you choose to use classification with a Fitzpatrick scale, instead of actually measuring it objectively, it creates this overblown variation in Europeans. It basically overweights and privileges the variation that we find in Europeans. And it says, okay, well, it doesn't matter. Everybody else basically looks the same. So what's interesting about this is that skin color is an example where we have a better method, yet people are drawn to classification because there is something intuitive about it, even if the intuition is misleading. People tend to think categorically. We put things in boxes. And so if there is the option to put things in boxes, we're going to say, okay, I think that that fits. And we have to challenge that, both as scientists and I think just as people who talk about human variation. So that was skin color. Let's talk about hair morphology, because that's my bread and butter. So this map here is a map by the Italian geographer Renato Biasutti. And basically what you're seeing here is an attempt to summarize the kinds of hair textures we find around the world. And in the legends, we see terms that we often use, just in everyday language to describe this thing that can be called hair morphology. So some of these words describe the continuum of variation in curvature from straight to curly hair. And then you have other terms that describe cross-sectional properties like flat, cylindrical, or oval. And then you have other words sprinkled in that describe other aspects of hair. So short, for example, I assume refers to the length of hair. And then coarse has to do with the diameter of someone's hair fibers, but it also makes people think about ideas of quality of hair. Like we think fine hair is better than coarse hair. And what's important to note here is this combination of traits. So like I said before, right, like there's composite traits. That's a problem when we talk about human variation, because the way that this is being presented here is suggesting that straight hair is always coarse and it always has a cylindrical cross-section. Curly hair is always short and it always has a flat cross-section. And creating a categorization system where certain traits always occur together makes it impossible to see the cases when that's not actually true. So to talk about hair morphology a little bit more, what is it? We usually talk about it as straight, wavy, and curly. Sometimes we include frizzy. Sometimes there is a slightly wavy, and sometimes we distinguish between big curls and small curls, but regardless of what words we use, all of these are subjective categories. So if we actually want to describe this, phenotype of hair morphology, we need to consider carefully what the levels of hair morphology are. So first, there's the entire scalp. That's really what we're talking about when we're on the level of hair texture. When we're talking about straight hair, curly hair, whatever hair type, we're talking about the level of the entire scalp. But you can also go down to the individual fiber. You can even go in more detail than that and look at the microstructure of hair fibers. And you can even go beyond that and look at molecular aspects of hair morphology. But what I do is, on the level of the individual hair fiber, I look at cross-section and I look at curvature. So to unpack that, curvature describes that spectrum from straight to curly. And so the way that you can think about it is, if you were going to fit a circle to the curve of a hair, what's the size of that circle? The smaller the curl is, the smaller the circle is, and the smaller its radius is. And the smaller the radius is, the larger the curvature is. When it comes to cross-sections, cross-sectional morphology includes the variation that is a matter of shape, ranging from round to oval or elliptical, and that's known as eccentricity. Then there is the actual area of that cross-section. So like I said before, when people talk about fine hair versus coarse hair, they're really talking about the cross-sectional area of individual hair fibers. So if classifying hair is so bad, why aren't more people measuring it like at least we do with skin color? Well, it turns out that it's because it's pretty time-consuming and hard to do. And when we talk about cross-sections, for example, there's a lot of steps you have to go through. You have to slice the hair shaft open. You have to use a microscope to look at its cross-section. And, you know, even though it's hard, it's something that we've been doing since the 19th century, which is why you can find super old papers like this one that talk about cross-sectional differences in different races of humans. But something that I learned as I was starting to do my research on hair is that there are some issues with existing methods. So first of all, if you want to measure the cross-section of a hair, you have to first embed it in something to make that sectioning easier. And with these standard methods that we use, you're usually using resin, which can take 24 hours or longer to actually fully dry. And then if you're embedding curly hairs, it's even more of a challenge, because when that resin dries, those hairs might not all be perfectly aligned. And that's so important if you want to get like a clean transverse cut. So as if that's not enough, cutting resin is actually really hard. So you need really specialized and expensive tools to cut through that hard material. So one of the things that I did during my PhD is I worked on developing new methods that would make taking images of cross-sections and measuring cross-sections easier. So after a lot of trial and error, I came across this material, this material that had a very low melt point, and was a plastic called polycaprolactone. And what I did is I put together a protocol, steps for embedding hair, no matter how curly they were, instantly. And so all you had to do was stretch them using a tweezer, and you push them into the heated plastic and it gets encased immediately. And the added bonus of using a soft plastic like that is that it's soft enough to cut with a razor at the end. So this is now something that becomes a lot more feasible for people to do. You can do a lot more hairs in the same amount of time. Now, unlike cross sections, measuring curvature is something that we don't have a long history of doing. So the oldest mention I could find was from 1973, when this man called Daniel Herdee, who was an undergraduate at Harvard at the time, published a study on quantitative hair variation. And in this publication, he described a new way of measuring hair curvature. Now, the main issue with curvature is that you can describe it mathematically, sure, but it's a two-dimensional thing, curvature, and hair curls in 3 dimensions. So the way that Herdy solved that issue is that he flattened the hairs between two glass slides. And that allowed him to measure the curves along the hair fibers by comparing them to arcs of known sizes. And so as the first method of its kind, it was really revolutionary because nobody, as far as I can tell, nobody had measured hair curl before. But the steps that you have to take to, do his method, they were pretty time intensive. And also flattening the hairs, no matter how carefully you do it, you're introducing some kind of distortion. So another aspect of what I did during my PhD was thinking, okay, how can we invent new methods that are going to allow us to more accurately measure hair curl in a shorter period of time and on a larger scale? So I came up with a protocol that overcame the three-dimensional issue in another way, which is cutting the hairs. So instead of flattening them, you can cut the hairs to 3 millimeters or smaller. So if they're in short enough fragments, they don't curl in 3 dimensions anymore. They only curl in 1 dimension. And dealing with short fragments of hair is a lot nicer in the lab because you can just transfer them into tubes, put them through a whole washing process, and then throw them into a Petri dish, and then take those images. And those methods, lab protocols that I talked to you about, they prepare the hair samples to be imaged, but that still leaves the image analysis. So there's a lot of programs out there that scientists use to measure all kinds of aspects of things in images, but there weren't any for hair specifically. And so what that meant is that you ended up having to do a lot of manual work. So actually, when I started doing this work as an undergraduate, I had to manually draw circles on these flattened hairs for hours, and that is not fun. So what I spent a lot of time doing was creating a computer program, basically a Python program that's available for free if you should want to measure hair fragments. And what it does is it takes these images of cross sections and it processes them to the point that we can actually just extract the information that we need automatically without you sitting in front of the computer. And I did the same thing for curvature. So something that used to take hours to do manually, you can now literally just point to the folder in your computer where the images are and sit back and live your best life. That said, it still takes time. This is more difficult than pointing at someone and saying, this is what your hair type is. So a lot of times people ask me, is it really worth the effort? Are you getting that much more information? Is the information you're getting actually useful biologically? Or could we just have said, okay, this is what your hair type is and gotten the same results? Well, the way that I want to answer that question of, is it really worth the effort, is by showing you some of the results that I found in my dissertation. So one of the things that I'm very interested in is so-called admix populations. So as Nick covered in some detail, especially in the US, but in a lot of places in the world, you have people who have, so-called admixed ancestries. And really what that means is that they are part of a population where the ancestors are not all equally related to each other recently. It means that there are some people who come from one place and one group and other people who come from another group. And one of the examples that you can think of is, for example, African Americans. They have European ancestry and they have African ancestry. And a lot of Latin Americans have African ancestry, European ancestry, and Native American ancestry. So admixed populations are really interesting genetically because they really show how categorizing people into races is useless. Because if there are people who have these admixed ancestries, so multiple races in their ancestry, how can you possibly put them in one category? And it also challenges us to think, okay, what is the variation that we can see here? So one of the things that we can do in genetics is to think about admixed populations where the two groups of ancestors that contributed to ancestry are very divergent in some traits. We can take a trait like that and say, okay, how can the admix population give us more information about the genetics of this trait? So for example, this is something that we've done a lot with admix populations that have West African and European ancestry. So in that case, you know that one of the groups of ancestors had very light skin, the other group of ancestors had very dark skin. And what you will then see is a correlation between the percentage of ancestry of one group and an individual similarity to that group in a particular trait. So with skin color, for example, that's what we see here. You have group of ancestors on do is say, okay, so the more African ancestry you have, the more African fragments of DNA you have, the more fragments we think you will have that encode genetic variation that makes your skin darker. And that is a pattern that we see here. Now, that is not something that would be possible if there was no difference in a trait between two populations. So what I thought is, okay, there's all this cool research that's looked at admixed European African populations and been able to understand the genetics of skin color. What about hair? Could we do something similar with hair morphology? If we have an admixed population and we know that their African ancestors on average probably had more tightly curled hair than their European ancestors, maybe there would be a similar pattern. So I did this for my dissertation, and basically the way that it worked, and I'll take you through the process, is I started with a huge sample of individuals that my lab had previously collected, and I looked for people who had mainly African and European ancestry. So that's what we call a two-way admixture. So you have admixture from mainly two different sources. And then I looked for people who had a significant amount of African ancestry, so more than 10%. And then the main limiting factor was, of course, whether we had a hair sample. So in the end, I had about a little bit less than 200 individuals, and I was able to measure curvature the way that I showed you for every single one of those. I also had skin reflectance, so what their skin pigmentation was. And I also was able to do the cross-sectional morphology for some of these individuals. So the first set of results that I wanted to look at was to check whether in my sample, we saw that same pattern I showed you earlier. So what we would expect here is if we have people who have mainly European and African ancestry, we would expect that on average, people who have more African ancestry have darker skin because they will have more sections of their genome that encode variation that they inherited from African ancestors. And those African ancestors had a lot of genetic variation that would have encoded for darker skin. And it was a huge relief and very exciting to find that that was the case here. We saw that, yes, the more African ancestry you had, the darker your skin was on average. So then the big question was, are we going to find the same thing with hair curvature? And I was very excited to find that, yes, that is the case. The more African ancestry these individuals had, on average, the curlier their hair was. This is something that would have been impossible to find if we had just categorized hair. And I can show you. So to compare with hair types, this is what we would have gotten. So here I've taken the same chart, so percentage of African ancestry on the x-axis and how curly someone's hair is on the y-axis. It's that same correlation, but here I color coded by different hair types. So what you see is that what we consider very curly hair or frizzy hair has a huge range of quantitative variation. All of that variation is collapsed when you just put it in that category of very curly or frizzy. And then curly has a good range of variation. Wavy has a very tiny range of variation, and straight straight, everybody agrees on what straight hair is at least. So that's nice. But it shows you just how important it is to think really critically about the categories that we're using to talk about different traits, because the way we talk about hair morphology, we can easily tell the difference between wavy hair and to some extent, curly hair, but we can't tell the difference between kind of very curly hair, moderately very, very curly hair, and super, super, super curly hair. Like literally, we don't have the words for it. And where words fail, you need to have other methods like measuring a trait. So another thing that was really interesting to look at here was relating to that point I made about composite traits. So I don't know how many of you Google things about hair on the internet. That's probably just me. But if you have ever done that, and if you've ever Googled like, okay, why is curly hair curly? You may have found a lot of materials saying that what makes hair have the shape that it has is its cross-section. If you have a round cross-section, you have straight hair. If you have a flat cross-section, you have curly hair. And that is something that a lot of people have been saying for many years, but it isn't accurate. And I was able to test that in my sample. So here we have, our same group of individuals, but on the x-axis this time we have how eccentric the hair is. So on the left side, you'd have the roundest hairs, and then you'd have the flattest hairs. And then you have curvature on the y-axis. So if it was true that the flatter your hair is, the curlier it is, you would have seen this this correlation, right? Like, it would be very clear. And you can kind of see a correlation here. It's definitely significant, but what is being confused here is the difference between the effect that cross-section has on curvature and things that are simply differently distributed between ancestries. So what we know is that African hair is usually said to be very flat in its cross-section, and it's usually very curly. So as a geneticist, one of the things that you want to know is, are these two separate traits that happen to occur in this population, or are they physically linked? Like, is there a physical reason why hair would be curlier if its cross-section was flatter? And what's exciting about looking at admix populations is that you can ask that question because you can do a statistical correction for ancestry. And once you correct for ancestry, that correlation is no longer there. So if you take into account how much African ancestry someone has, there is no more relationship between these two traits. And that brings us back to, this idea of racializing human variation. So racializing human variation is something that happens when you start using qualitative categories. So these subjective groupings that are based off of the idea that there's different types of traits and different types of people. And it's also something that is made easier by composite phenotypes. So combining things that you shouldn't think of together. This may not be very convincing to you when it comes to hair, because you're like, oh, well, I don't know, that doesn't make sense. But let me give you another example. Here we have melanin index on the x-axis, and we have curvature on the y-axis. When you don't correct for ancestry, there's a correlation between those two. There is a very significant correlation between those two. But if you think about it logically, does it make sense? Like, do we have any biological reason to think that the darker your skin would be, the curlier your hair would be? No, of course, those are two separate traits. And so once you correct for ancestry, that's something that you can see. You can see that there is no relationship between these two traits. Just because you have darker skin doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have curlier hair or vice versa. Now, taking all that information, I just want to conclude by discussing why this is all so important. Typologies, and so these categorizations, these subjective categorizations, they significantly affect our perception. And what happens as a consequence of that is that it affects our ability to generate hypotheses, especially when the wording we use is kind of a red herring. A great example of this is Black versus white skin. Now, until the 50s and even later, you can find people saying in scientific publications that they thought it was strange that Negroes had Black skin, even when they lived in such sunny climates. Now, their reasoning was, you don't want to have Black skin in a place that's super sunny because Black objects, they absorb more radiation in the sun, and so that's bad. They literally thought it was a proven disadvantage to have dark skin in places that were sunny. And what's even funnier to me is that they concluded that even though there's no advantage to having more melanin in places that are sunny, it was a little bit strange that you had this pattern of, everyone who lives in a very high UV place having darker skin. And this seems ridiculous to us now because, wherever you turn on the internet, you hear people talk about melanin. We know how important melanin is. But not too long ago, that was taken seriously. And what this shows us is that moving from skin color to objectively measured pigmentation didn't just allow us to appreciate the range of variation across human populations, across Africa, but it revealed a pattern that helped us form and test hypotheses on the evolutionary function of skin pigmentation and how that relates to UV radiation. And when it comes to hair, using curvature instead of these racialized categories that we use for talking about hair texture is important because hair also has a similar kind of red herring. Something that you'll sometimes hear people use to describe tightly curled hair that's actually really just derogatory is calling it woolly. And I talk to people sometimes about woolly hair syndrome, and they're often shocked to find out that there's such a racist medical condition. But the idea that tightly curled hair is like wool has a long history. And as somebody who researches this from the evolutionary perspective, I wonder how much of a role it played in us not even considering that tightly curled hair, just like dark skin, might actually be a benefit in these very sunny places. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this because we don't have the time, but the Cliff Notes version is that I did some research that showed that tightly curled hair minimizes heat gain, and hair does in general, especially when it comes to solar radiation. So what we did is we looked at the differences between having no hair and having hair, and we saw that hair offered protection against the sun. People who are bald and get sunburns in the sun will probably tell you this from personal experience. But what was even more exciting is that we were able to see in our experiments that the higher the curvature was, so that the tighter the curl was, the lower the amount of heat was that you would gain from solar radiation. So that meant you also didn't need to sweat as much, but that's a separate story. To reiterate, what this is showing us is that tightly curled hair is not wool, and the language we use is misleading. So we have to move past not only this language, but just classification in general. So moving past classification, for scientists, that requires more than just new methods. Some of what I have to do and what a lot of scientists, have to do when they create new knowledge is to critique existing work. The way I like to think of it is doing a Marie Kondo on bad science. If you look at a piece of scientific information and it does not spark joy, get rid of it. By which I mean, critique it and at least don't just uncritically perpetuate it. So just to put the takeaway, one thing that's important to know is that the way that people think about human variation in terms of race, that's not just because they're ignorant. Race doesn't just persist because of ignorance. It's an issue of us lacking the language and not giving people the tools to describe human variation in another way. And another thing I'd like you to take away is that subjective categories distort variability, and that composite phenotypes or composite traits, they make these racial categorizations a lot easier to do. So when we move forward, what we need to do is to critique bad work in addition to creating new knowledge. So that's all from me. I just wanted to thank a couple of people. And if you want to find me, I am online way too much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lasisi. So now we will do a little Q&A session. So if you have any questions at all, again, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A box. So I think we do have some questions to start. Athena, if you want to ask a question.
Yeah, sure. So our first question is in the Q&A box. It comes from Christian Berg, and it's for Mr. Sheedy. So going over census records, how do you reconcile determinations of race not entered by the person, him or herself? It seems if someone is of mixed heritage, they can be listed as Black, white, or mulatto in different censuses, taken decades apart, all depending on who and how and when they collect that information.
That's an excellent question. This is relevant for the African-American research that we do all the time for finding your roots. So I guess the first thing to emphasize is that the census enumerators had specific letters or responses that they were supposed to put in that column, that race column. And in the earlier censuses, say, it changed a little bit, and I'm not going to be able to quote it exactly, but in the earlier censuses, say 1870, 1880, you had a little more variation, say Black, mulatto, or white, you know, when we're talking about African-American versus white people on the censuses. And so you got that discretion. As you move forward on the censuses, you still get Black, mulatto, and white, but then at some point Black becomes Negro and mulatto goes away. So you come up to like I think it's 1930 or 1940, it might be both. You don't even have the option for mulatto. And so becomes more Black and white. And so the race that goes in that column on the censuses is limited to what the census enumerators were told their options were. Then the next thing is, you don't necessarily know who the informant was. So somebody shows up to a household, who in the household gave the information? When it comes to the race column, the enumerator probably wrote down what he saw. And so there it becomes very subjective. It's the eye of the beholder. And he may not have asked, are you guys white? Are you guys Black? Are you mulatto? If he didn't ask that question, it didn't come from whoever in the household gave other information on the census. The enumerator just wrote down what he saw. And I've seen on the earlier censuses, 1870, 1880, where you did have the option for mulatto. And say you find somebody in a census over years, and they're Black here, they're white there, mulatto here. It becomes so subjective. But you have somebody who, maybe we even proved they had a white father and a Black mother. You know, they're mixed race. They're mulatto in later censuses, but they're Black when they're a child, 1870. Well, if I sometimes look on that census page, you know, the enumerator would have covered that whole enumeration district. And you look up and down the page, you look pages before, pages after, and all this enumerator did was go Black or white. And nobody's recorded as being mulatto. Well, this was an enumerator who saw Black and white. He either didn't care, he didn't give attention to detail, or he just saw the world in black and white. You were either Black, you were white, and that's all he wrote. And so to answer your question, you have to do a full census survey and look at other records, marriage records, births if you have them, death records, and see what race is given for somebody over the course of their whole life. And after you've gathered all those records, then you can assess the situation and see, weigh the evidence. But my suggestion is, even if somebody's listed as Black on most records, if one or even two records say mulatto, somebody at least looked at that person and recognized that they had a significant amount of European ancestry. And so that is a hint that maybe not one parent was 100% white, maybe one grandparent or two grandparents, but that is an indication that somebody had more of European admixture if they're considered Black in most records. If they're considered mulatto on one or two records, then somebody looked at that person and through their lens, they thought that person had more European admixture than somebody who would have been 100% African. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Mr. Sheedy. So that should help. So we actually, our next question, well, it wasn't really a question, is actually just a compliment for Dr. Lasisi on her amazing work with her PhD. And also the question after that, I believe it was also for Dr. Lasisi. It's just, there's like a little blurb about, I guess, like some background on the question. If a group of 1,000 Nigerians of the darkest possible skin were parachuted into Finland and did not intermarry and had no access to vitamin D and other benefits of modern culture, how many generations would it take before their skin color would be as light as anything found on Earth? The question being, how plastic a trait is skin color?
Great question. Sounds like you would love to do a little bit of population genetics modeling here. Huh? So basically, you are asking about particular details that I can't. Okay, let me answer this question in two different ways. One of the issues that we have here is that we don't let people die. That's one of the love that about humans. I mean, in the last few years, sometimes like, I question, but generally we take care of each other. And if some of us have a physical trait or, any other kind of trait that makes us struggle to live. I see a lot of people with glasses here. I myself have glasses. We basically provide something for that. So this is my way of saying that I can't answer that question from like, modern day dark-skinned Nigerians and modern day Finnish people, because what we would do is that we would make sure that, these Nigerians had vitamin D, just like, a Welsh person who happens to be in Australia now would wear sunscreen. We won't just like let them roast and turn into lobsters, although, some people are into that. But if you think about, these things aside and we let natural selection take its course, we actually still don't have a great answer to that, because we don't know exactly how and like, with what the strength of the selection was. And that's really what you're talking about. You're talking about, okay, if we have all of these dark-skinned individuals, how is that going to change from generation to generation? You can only have natural selection if there is variation. So when you say there's like, how plastic of a trait is it, you are talking about something separate from natural selection, right? If you're talking about multiple generations and them becoming lighter and lighter skinned, that would not be possible if everyone had exactly the same skin color. And if no one ever had a mutation that affected skin color. So basically their skin color would never change, or it would take a very long time to accumulate mutations on, genes that affect skin color. Now, the other answer to that question is related to how much of this is a tanning response, basically. Like, how dark is, someone's skin that is, just because of the sun. There is some level of effect there, but it's not enough that a Nigerian would do well in Finland, basically. Even Finnish people don't do well in Finland. So that's something that I would say you need to consider.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a very entertaining response. Okay, and our next question is, can you explain ethnicity? And I'm not sure if this goes to both speakers or just one, but feel free.
I can take this. So this is something I think about a lot. We use a lot of words to group people. Like, you'll see some people say race, you'll see some people say ethnicity, you'll see some people say population, and even saying group. All of these words are inconsistent. There is not one definition. And that is, if there's one thing I would love for, all of you to take home today, is that words have the meanings that we give them. And I feel like Nick Sheedy would know much better about this, because basically as a genealogist, you're a historian, you see the way that words take on different meanings over time. And when it comes to race versus ethnicity, some people really try to make a distinction. They try to say like, oh, race is, fake, and it was a way that we talked about biology and it's wrong or whatever, blah, blah. But ethnicity, that's real, that's cultural, but it's also DNA. Both of these things are basically wrong, because the way that some people use race, other people will use the term ethnicity. And the way that some people use ethnicity, some people will say that's a population. So when it comes to ethnicity, usually what the distinction is that people will allow for a level of self-identification that is usually not the case with race. So there's this idea that, your race is ascribed to you. Somebody says this is what your race is. There's a general agreement of what your race is. But with ethnicity, you can just pick what it is. And when you actually start digging a little deeper, that's not the case. You can't just say, I'm Italian. Italians will not have it unless you're actually Italian. There is some level of group agreement. So when it comes to ethnicity, even though people talk about culture, to some extent, they're also talking about basically relatedness. Like, there is still this idea that people of the same ethnicity are more closely genetically related to each other than they are to people of other ethnicities. And this also breaks down when you start talking about admixture. And what you're seeing here is just a fundamental limitation of categories and taxonomy. So when we try to group biological things, and especially humans, because we're also closely related to each other, we cannot make clean, non-overlapping categories, because humans, like a lot of biological organisms, are just messy. So went on a little bit of a tangent, but
I'd love to chime in on that one as well. From a historical or genealogical perspective, I find a lot of the racial or ethnic designations were created or invented out of a desire of power and control. And so it wasn't done to just, altruistically say, oh, these people are African-American or Black, or these people are white or European. It was done by mainly white people who wanted to maintain power and control and a social hierarchy based on this perceived racial designation. And if you go down, that's true in across the Deep South or anywhere where, in Jim Crow, where it really became black and white. But if you go down to Louisiana, say, and you get earlier on in our history, or if you go into the Caribbean, there was a much more diverse taxonomy. You had a lot more descriptive words. You had, instead of mulatto, mixed race, you had quadroons, 1/4. Somebody was 1/4 Black, or 1/4, they were quadroon. Then you had octoroons, and there were all sorts of other names that were used around the Caribbean islands to describe various different combinations of Black and white ancestry. And so that perception's changed over time, but at the root of it, the words that we use on public records especially were designed by people who had power and control, who wanted to maintain power and control. And so you have to keep that in mind. And then you can get into the idea, well, is this a total social construct? That's a political debate that I won't get into. But I had one other thing I was going to say about that. You have people who want to self-identify, and maybe they have some Black ancestry, some white ancestry. They want to identify. You had people who wanted to pass for white in the past, so they identified as white. You have people today who might be mixed race, and they culturally identify with their Black ancestry. But you can say that, and especially with Native American, you might have some Native American ancestry, but if you say, I am a Native American, well, no, you're not, unless you're a member of a tribe. And to be a member of a recognized tribe, the tribe has to agree to allow you membership. And so there is a recognition that's necessary there for you to say, I am a Native American versus I have Native American heritage, or I have Native American ancestry. And so it kind of goes both ways there. When you talk about ethnicity as a social construct, you need to be accepted into that group. Just like if I go to Italy and I say, I want to be Italian today. Well, I ain't Italian. So, but it's very subjective as well. And that's the other thing to emphasize. Very subjective. And our opinions, our personal opinions, are often shaped by, descriptions and a history that's simply not accurate. And more importantly, was designed to maintain a level of power and control. And so I think that's an important thing to recognize.
Okay, thank you so much. We have another like a follow-up kind of question. For ethnicity, I was also relating it to Hispanic versus non-Hispanic.
I mean, those are specifically US ideas of ethnicity, and the census is the weirdest interpretation of ethnicity that anyone has ever seen, that there should only be two ethnicities and that those ethnicities are Hispanic or non-Hispanic is ridiculous to everyone. But I mean, obviously, Nick could speak to this, but there is this idea of, we want to understand if you come from a Spanish speaking background or not, as separate from your race. And what's interesting is that they've done polls among Latino individuals, and what they've said is that they struggle to put their race in any of the available categories. And so the ethnicity that they have to choose as separate from race makes it complicated for them, because the way that they experience their life is as if Hispanic was actually a race and not just an ethnicity. But part of this also has to do with, you have multiple worlds colliding, right? Like you have the US, which is Anglophone, and that has its own history of colonization that is separate from the Spanish-speaking colonized regions, where now you have these people coming into the US. And so their identity then needs to be created into these categories that didn't exist in the Anglophone colony that begat the US. But Nick, I don't know if you want to chime in on that.
I can just a little bit, but I'm not really familiar with what is the exact definition of Hispanic or not Hispanic, and where does a Hispanic person come from? Obviously Latin America, US South, anywhere south of the border. But my guess is, these census enumerators, or not census enumerators, but the people that make up the questions for the censuses, they have an idea in mind how they want to use that to shape policy. And so they just have to invent ways to create statistics that they then use to apply to policies for immigration, say. And so, I have a cousin, my cousin John, married a young woman from Mexico. Well, she's not young anymore. She's young as I am. I think that people that identify as Hispanic, I think that's probably a lot more of a cultural identity than a racial identity. What is their background? Where do the people come from? I think it's probably far more of a cultural thing. But ultimately, again, it's the powers that be. It's somebody in government who wants to use this information to create public policy and create immigration laws, and again, that is, in some respects, that's still a measure of power and control. They want to have exercise some power and control over immigration at the southern border of the United States. And so there again, you have a definition that we then use for cultural identity, that's created by somebody for a purpose that's not just, you know, warm and fuzzy, you know, what holidays do you celebrate and what foods do you enjoy and that sort of things, you know, the things that we would normally associate with, you know, just your culture. What sort of music do you listen to, etc. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. But again, you have on the census, you know, people are give you very few options because they have very specific ideas in mind how they want to use that information.
Thank you. That was it was very interesting to just hear both of the sides of that question. There was another, like, I think another addition onto that question. I think it was, why do they use it? So I think maybe that might have been referring to why do they use two answers for that question on the census?
I mean, why do the categories exist? I think that that's basically something that Nick covered. Like, you have to understand who is making things. Like, if you are asking about why the US Census does what the US Census does, I'm an anthropologist, so I don't want to say I don't care, but I consider it to be separate from any biology or separate from, you know, what people's even their cultural understandings are, what their demography is. The census is trying to get information specifically for voting, and, you know, without turning this into a political lecture, but I think that all of us are old enough to remember what happened with the last census and how, you know, there were interests. I don't know what those interests were. I don't know what they were hoping to achieve, but you can see that it has very close, like a very close relationship to policy, to, you know, how different resources get allocated. And it allows some politicians to make the case that, I don't know, some people who they think shouldn't be in certain places are in certain places, and whatnot. But that is, I think, you know, very separate from what is an interesting question, which is, well, sorry, not to say that that's not an interesting question, but what I would consider a more interesting question, which is, like, you know, how people's understanding of these groups change over time and how they change once people move across borders. Like, you will hear a lot of people say that the way that they experienced their racial identity and ethnic identity changed when they came from Mexico to the US, or when they even came from Puerto Rico to mainland US. Like, these are interesting things that tell you about how people perceive differences between groups.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay, we had another question. Okay. I don't think I'm going to be pronouncing this right. So, okay, wait, I'll go with the first question. I'm pretty sure this one was for Dr. Lasisi, or no, I'm sorry. I'm not really sure who this one was for. Why on the census they only gave the option black or white, though on the draft cards they gave 6 or 7 options from light to black? Anyone can answer.
Well, I'll go on that. So different censuses, you go back into the 1800s and up to 1940, the 1950 census becomes available in April. I can't recall off the top of my head exactly what the options were, but they were, like I say, limited. But then, yeah, you go to the draft cards. Draft cards are great genealogical resources. World War I and World War II, practically every man in the United States between a particular age group, from the age of 18 up to the, you know, into their 40s, sometimes into their 50s and 60s for the World War II old man census. Everybody had to fill one of these out, so they're fantastic genealogical references, because you get pretty much every adult man in the United States, unless they're really old or under the age of 18, would have had a draft card. And yes, there are, you have a racial designation there, but I don't believe that there were 6 or 7 options from light to black. On World War I draft cards, it's black or white. You have Indian, and then you get up to the World War II. I believe that they used the designation Negro instead of black. But again, you know, this is what you have to choose from. These are, you can't just self-identify. And the reason they did that, especially World War I, is because the military was segregated. If you were Black, you went into a Black unit. Black units were mainly, they went into the, they didn't see as much combat. They did a lot of the grunt work, the supply line work. I'm forgetting there's a term for that part of the Army, the quartermasters. The quartermasters who handled a lot of the supply lines, a lot of the maintenance on equipment, a lot of the manual labor. They were stevedores, they were loading ships, unloading ships, driving trucks, rather than in combat. And so it was only into the World War II where you had the military became desegregated eventually. But race was important to some people who had power and control because they wanted to separate and segregate Black people and white people in the military. So that's why they asked to begin with.
Thank you so much, Nick Sheedy. Okay, so the next question is, why were Caucasians/Acadians considered a mixed race if they were white?
I can go for that one as well. So the Acadians are a group of people of French extraction who migrated to what's now the maritime region of Canada. We're talking Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island. So this was a different group than the French Canadians who settled in Quebec, say in the early to mid and late 1600s. The Acadians came later. The Acadians came late 1600s into the mid 1700s. Well, after England and France fought a war in the 1750s and French Canada was ceded to England, England said, okay, you guys in Quebec, we'll keep that lower Canada, you guys can stay, you're all right, but you're still English subjects. However, the Acadians, who had not been as settled as long in what's now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, they said, you know what, you guys need to leave. And they were displaced. And these Acadians then were forced out. Some may have gone to Quebec, others were forced into the lower colonies and ended up in Georgia or some in Massachusetts. I did a little research on them recently. But they end up just getting dispersed, and many of them end up in Louisiana because it had been a French colony and they spoke French. Culturally, they were similar. And so these Acadians integrate into Louisiana. Sometimes they marry people of mixed race and become mixed race. And this is the root population for people called Cajun today. And so the Acadians initially would have been French. After they come to Louisiana or Haiti or wherever they end up becoming mixed race because they intermarried with people whose ancestors originated elsewhere. And so you end up getting African admixture, maybe a little Indian admixture, Native American admixture. And so Canadians and Cajuns are not necessarily the same ethnic group.
Okay, so we have two more questions. Clara, do you want to read the next two?
Sure, 1 second. So do you see DNA testing becoming more or less popular? I assume this is for Lasisi.
I cannot imagine it becoming less popular. We're still very much at the beginning of it. And the way I like to think about, DNA testing and its popularity is everybody wants to know what kind of pizza they are, like it's the BuzzFeed quiz that we all do. And DNA testing, when you're talking about something like 23andMe, other than, your ancestry, especially when you're talking about specific traits, unless it's something medical that's very well known, it's not exactly guesswork, but it isn't also going to necessarily be a prediction that you can trust 100%. So actually, Athena, you'll probably remember from your experience on the seedlings that there was somebody who found out that they were apparently lactose intolerant, right? Like they were like, oh, I guess I'm lactose intolerant. And then Dr. Bunu pointed out, well, no, you know whether you are or are not lactose intolerant. What this is telling you is whether you have a genetic variant that has been associated with people who have that, and how genetic variants affect you as an individual can often be really complicated. It's not just a case of you have a gene for something, but people think it's exciting. I think it's exciting. I did my 23andMe, and I would throw my DNA anywhere because I'm like, I'm an international student, so the US government already knows everything that there is to know about me. I'm not hiding from anyone. I want to know what kind of pizza I am. And I was disappointed to find out that my parents had never lied to me. Everything they said is true. No surprises there. So it becomes this fun pastime. And I think that the cheaper it becomes, the more that people can do things with it. Now, what I would say is you want to be careful and cognizant of the fact that this is, to some extent, what I like to call genetic astrology. I'm a Pisces. I may not necessarily make life decisions based on that. I may excuse my behavior with that in mind. And you could do something similar with your DNA results, basically, for fun, for entertainment. But there are people who take advantage of it because there are profits to be made. And I'm not going to say that, people are necessarily like sitting there, rubbing their hands together, thinking that they're evil. People often genuinely believe in the things they peddle. And one of the main things that you'll see these days is how you can change and adapt your life based on your DNA. So they'll say, look, this is the diet that you should follow, or this is the kind of exercise that you should do. The exercise one I think is especially fun because it was like, oh, like, is long distance better for you, or do you need to do interval training? Mine said interval training, and I said, no, I am not going to do intervals. So, keep your truth and use the DNA for fun.
I'll throw something out there with the DNA as well, and that is it's become an amazing tool for genealogy. We connect dots that we could have never connected before, especially for adoptees or people who have a parent or grandparent who their father or mother's unknown. And I've solved mysteries in my own family. My grandma Betty's grandfather was born in 1852, and I figured out who his biological father was. Well, not exactly. One of 8 brothers. 8 brothers. We probably won't nail it down. But as a genealogy tool, yeah, it's amazing, very, very popular for that. And at 23andMe, it is kind of cool. They got a setback from the FDA, but they have moved forward. But a lot of people have initially tested with 23andMe because they thought they would get this great health information. And as an example, if you have genetic markers BRCA1 or BRCA2, you are pretty much guaranteed to get a very aggressive form of breast cancer. And if you go in, or did a few years ago, to a hospital, say, I want to get tested for BRCA1 or BRCA2. All right, here's a bill for $6,000 when you're done. Well, you can go to 23andMe and pay $100, $79 on sale, and find out if you have these same 2 markers. And it's important to me. I have 2 friends who recently have gone through cancer treatment and surgery because they found out they had BRCA1, BRCA2. They've been monitoring that. And so the DNA, you wouldn't have known that otherwise 20 years ago. But also, I've been involved in some very large population studies. The Veterans Administration had one, and other universities and organizations have tried to use DNA to pinpoint genetic markers and predisposition for specific ailments across the board. And the landlord in the office building where I had in Utah came from a pioneer Mormon family, and it turned out that he had a specific type of early onset dementia, and it ran in his family. Some of his relatives had it. Well, he was contacted to be in a study, and he started talking to my boss, Johnny Cerny, about it. And Johnny said, well, we're kind of in a situation where we could help you out here. And we mapped out his entire family tree. And because he got more of his relatives involved in the study that, other people who are not even related to him were involved, but we were able to map out his family tree and trace back on which lines this trait was inherited, and it was a specific woman. It was, the second or third wife of one of these polygamous Mormons way back when, and we were able to say that woman carried this gene because descendants only from her in this family group are the ones that carry it today, and they're moving forward with, groundbreaking studies that may end up developing a cure for this particular type of early onset dementia. So it's really cool, groundbreaking stuff. And you can take the DNA yourself and get some of these results. But if you're like me, who else is going to have access to this information? And is somebody else going to use, who is in a position of power and control, going to use it for their own purposes to form policies that I might not necessarily agree with? So you do need to be cautious who has access to this information in the future. And I think that we're going to see, we're going to have to see some more discussion about that.
Thank you so much. So technically we are out of time, but I just quickly wanted to just share some of the resources, because I know somebody did actually ask about your socials and stuff like that. Couple things, Mr. Sheedy, you are on Facebook, and then the whole Finding Your Roots thing is also on Facebook. Dr. Lasisi has an amazing TikTok page, so definitely check that out. Definitely reaching out to like the younger generations with that. Really interesting and funny stuff, so definitely go check that out. But all of it will be on here. So this is the Seedling Resource. The curriculum, the series, and at-home materials are all found on their website. And then we have our website, the Finding Your Roots curriculum again, the episodes, Dr. Henry Louis Gates, his show, the Science You at Home special. That link is actually a different link, which will be put in the chat soon. Nick Sheedy's stuff, Dr. Brandon Abudu's, and Dr. Lasisi's, and then also Lindsay Fulton, who was a guest mentor on the Finding Years of Seedlings show. Definitely check her stuff out as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you so much to our speakers for amazing presentations.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you again.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. A lot of fun.
Bye. Thank you.